Hi everyone. Tonight I'll tell you a slow, long story about why food in the Middle Ages was, frankly, pretty terrible. It wasn't just bad by modern standards, it was often unpleasant, unsafe, and deeply repetitive. In this story, we'll slowly drift through the muddy roads of history, pass by smoky hearths and wooden tables, and explore how everyday people managed to fill their stomachs in a world without fridges, supermarkets, or seasoning variety. Let's begin. If you were a peasant in medieval Europe, your meals were defined by three things: what grew near you, what survived the seasons, and what you could afford, which, in most cases, was very little. For the vast majority of people, daily food wasn't about flavor or choice. It was about survival. In the countryside, diets revolved around grain, mostly in the form of coarse bread. But even that was not always reliable. Some years the harvest failed due to bad weather, war, or disease. And when that happened, hunger followed like a shadow. Meat, despite how often it appears in medieval feasts in modern movies, was rarely available to common folk. Most peasants didn't eat pork or beef on any regular basis. They might keep pigs or chickens, but these animals were valuable for their eggs or for breeding. Killing one was a loss. If you were lucky, you might eat salted pork during winter, but even then, meat preservation was difficult and expensive. Without proper refrigeration, meat would spoil quickly. So, it was often heavily salted, dried, or smoked, and even then, it tasted nothing like modern jerky or deli meat. And then there was gruel. A common staple. Gruel was essentially a porridge made from oats, barley, or other grains boiled in water. It was filling, but not particularly exciting. Sometimes, if you had access to a little milk or broth, you could mix it in for flavor. But more often, gruel was plain, lumpy, and gray. It stuck to the sides of the pot. It stuck to your spoon. It stuck to your ribs. And it didn't taste like much at all. Vegetables were seasonal and limited. You might grow onions, turnips, or leeks, but tomatoes, potatoes, and corn were completely unknown in Europe until centuries later, brought from the Americas after the age of exploration. So, your vegetable stew might consist of root vegetables, wild herbs, and maybe, on rare occasions, beans or lentils. Peasants couldn't afford imported spices. Salt was precious. Pepper, cinnamon, or cloves were treasures, too expensive and too far away. As for fruits, again, these were limited to what grew locally. Apples, berries, and plums could be gathered in season. But there were no bananas, no oranges, no tropical fruits. And even local fruits were eaten quickly after harvest, because preserving them was hard. You might dry some or ferment others into sour cider, but there were no cans or jars or freezers. Even drinking water was risky. Clean water was not always easy to find. Many streams and wells were polluted by waste. Boiling water helped, but that required fuel, and wood was another valuable resource. Because of this, many people drank ale, a weak beer made from barley, or watered-down wine. These drinks were not consumed for pleasure, but for safety. They were low in alcohol and often more trustworthy than the well. So, the next time you look at a medieval feast painting, remember, that was the exception. For kings and lords, meals might include roasts, pies, and jellied fish. But for most people, day after day, food was bland, limited, and repetitive. Bread, gruel, onions, maybe some cabbage. No sugar. No coffee. No chocolate. And it's only just the beginning. While noble tables groaned with platters of roasted meats and exotic spices, life for the average medieval person remained focused on one quiet, consistent goal: simply getting enough to eat. Hunger wasn't rare. It was routine. Many peasants lived in a constant state of near starvation, especially during the lean months between winter's end and spring's harvest. These months were called the hungry gap. During this time, food stores from the previous autumn were often depleted. The ground was still too cold for new crops to grow. Bread became thinner, portions smaller, and in some cases, meals disappeared entirely. To survive, people often turned to foraging, picking bitter greens, nettles, or bark. Some boiled grass-like plants just to have something warm in their bellies. It wasn't about nourishment anymore. It was about tricking the body into thinking it wasn't empty. In those times, even bread was dangerous. When grain was scarce or spoiled, bakers sometimes mixed in cheaper fillers, ground up beans, acorns, or even powdered chalk or clay. This made loaves heavier and stretch further, but it could also damage the stomach. In wet seasons, mold would grow on stored rye. One type of mold, Claviceps purpurea, caused ergot poisoning. Those who ate contaminated bread could suffer convulsions, hallucinations, burning limbs, or even death. People didn't understand the cause. They blamed witches, bad air, or angry saints. But it was the bread itself that was cursed. Even when food was safe, flavor was not a priority. The average kitchen, if it could even be called that, was dark, smoky, and basic. An open fire, a pot, and maybe a wooden ladle. There were no ovens for baking at home. Communal ovens existed in some villages, but they were often owned by the lord or the church, and peasants had to pay to use them. That meant most cooking was done by boiling. A single pot might hold the same stew for days. New ingredients were added each evening, but the pot was never truly emptied. This practice, called perpetual stew, meant yesterday's dinner blended into today's. The taste, as one might imagine, was hard to describe. Salt helped, if you had any. Salt was essential for preserving meat and fish, but it was expensive. In coastal areas, people might evaporate seawater to gather salt. Inland, salt had to be mined or traded, and the costs were high. In some regions, salt was even used as a form of currency. Without it, food spoiled faster. Fish turned sour. Meat went bad. People learned to eat quickly and without complaint. Speaking of fish, it played a larger role than many realize. The Catholic Church mandated many fasting days, sometimes over 100 per year, when meat was forbidden. That left fish as the only animal protein option. But again, freshness was an issue. Inland villages relied on preserved fish, salted cod, pickled herring, or dried eels. These were shipped in barrels and could taste rubbery, fishy, or just plain odd. But they were filling. And that was enough. Dairy products were also common when available: cheese, curds, and sour milk, but without refrigeration, they spoiled easily. Most cheese was heavily salted and aged to survive longer. Milk was usually consumed quickly or turned into butter. Yet even butter wasn't simple to come by. Churning cream took time and effort. Peasants who owned cows might sell their butter to wealthier townsfolk and go without themselves. All of this made variety almost impossible. A person could go their entire life eating only a handful of ingredients. They might never taste a lemon or a peach. They'd never smell vanilla or know what sugar truly was. The idea of snacks or dessert simply didn't exist. Food was fuel, barely enough, often unappetizing, but essential. And it was going to get stranger from here. As life trudged on in the muddy fields and smoky cottages of the medieval world, the relationship between people and food remained deeply practical. Nobody ate for pleasure, they ate to survive. But even survival was complicated by something else: the seasons. In modern times, grocery stores make strawberries available in winter and apples appear any day of the year. But in the Middle Ages, seasonality ruled all. There was no way to preserve fresh produce long term. Without refrigeration or industrial canning, the rhythm of meals followed the cycle of nature. When berries ripened in summer, people ate them fast or lost them to birds. When root vegetables were pulled in autumn, they were buried in cellars, hoping to last through winter. But once they shriveled or rotted, there was no replacement. You simply waited. And waiting meant hunger. As winter dragged on, stored onions softened, apples turned to mush, and carrots lost their crunch. Without green vegetables, people developed deficiencies. One of the most feared was scurvy, a disease caused by lack of vitamin C. It led to bleeding gums, fatigue, and eventually death. People didn't know the cause. They simply withered, and no amount of gruel could help. In richer homes, the kitchen offered some relief. But even among nobles, food could be strange. Spices were used heavily, not just for flavor, but sometimes to hide the taste of meat that had already started to spoil. There were dishes filled with vinegar, onions, and pepper, not because they were delicious, but because they were strong enough to mask decay. In banquets, chefs colored food with ground herbs or crushed flowers. They molded meat into shapes, stuffed birds with other birds, or served jelly-like dishes made from boiled bones. These weren't delicacies as we understand them, they were displays of power, wealth, and creativity within the limits of a very primitive system. Even among the elite, illness from food was common. There were no food safety standards. No understanding of bacteria. Shellfish spoiled quickly, and yet it was served. Undercooked pork could carry parasites. Water from fountains was still full of waste. Bread might contain sand from poorly cleaned grain. Everything you consumed came with a risk. And nobody washed their hands. Meanwhile, monasteries, though quieter than castles, had their own challenges. Monks followed strict dietary rules. Many were vegetarian by religious order. Their diets revolved around beans, bread, beer, and garden vegetables. They had the time and discipline to cook properly, and their meals were often better than those of peasants. But even monks lacked diversity in their food. They followed seasonal eating too. One week you might eat cabbage. The next, more cabbage. And then, if spring was slow, still more cabbage. And there was no escaping the labor. Whether rich or poor, food preparation took time. Bread had to be kneaded, left to rise, then baked, possibly in a shared oven. Butter had to be churned for hours. Grains had to be ground, often by hand, using heavy stones. Fires had to be built, pots stirred, herbs collected. There were no shortcuts, no machines, no pre-packaged anything. Cooking was daily, essential work. The average person might eat 2 meals a day. Breakfast was rare. The first meal came late in the morning, often after several hours of labor. The second came in the evening. Portions were small. If a child asked for more, there often wasn't more to give. Plates were wooden, spoons shared, and meat, when it appeared, was sliced thin and carefully rationed. This was daily life. Not a feast. Not a famine. Just a slow, grinding repetition of the same foods, prepared the same way, day after day. Bland. Gray. Functional. And as we'll see next, even the simple act of cooking could turn dangerous in more ways than one. In the cramped and smoky kitchens of the medieval world, danger was never far from the hearth. Cooking wasn't just hard work, it was risky. Open flames danced beneath iron pots suspended on hooks or propped on tripods. Firewood cracked and hissed, smoke curled through thatched roofs, and sparks flew freely. Chimneys were rare, and ventilation was poor. Most kitchens were filled with low, choking smoke, especially in winter when windows were kept shut to hold in warmth. Burns were common. So were house fires. One careless moment, a dropped ember, an unattended pot, a gust of wind, and an entire home could be lost. Thatched roofs caught fire easily. Villages, built tightly and mostly from wood, were vulnerable to blazes that spread house to house. In cities, fire regulations existed, but enforcement was weak. Buckets were kept nearby, and neighbors would shout and run with water. But often, it was already too late. Even the cooking tools themselves were dangerous. Knives were dull but still cut fingers. Grinders crushed more than grain if misused. Heavy cauldrons filled with stew could tip over, burning legs and feet. And there were no hospitals nearby. A burn or cut could easily become infected. Without antibiotics, even a small wound might lead to death days later. Then there was food poisoning. Without knowledge of germs, people relied on smell, sight, and tradition to decide if something was safe. Meat that had begun to turn might still be eaten, especially if it was salted or cooked in vinegar. Bread might be old or moldy but was still consumed. Dairy that curdled was sometimes turned into cheese, sometimes not. Eggs were rarely fresh, hens didn't lay year-round, so people learned tricks to guess whether an egg had spoiled. They held it to the ear, or floated it in water, but these were imperfect methods. And yet, despite the risks, food still brought people together. Communal meals were common. Entire families ate from one pot, dipping their spoons or crusts of bread. In villages, people gathered around shared fires or met at inns where simple meals were sold. Even monks dined side by side in long halls, eating in silence while scripture was read aloud. Eating was rarely solitary. It was a moment of warmth, brief as it was. Still, that warmth came with limits. Children were fed last. Guests ate before servants. Men before women in some places. Lords before peasants. Food was not only a necessity, it was a reminder of social order. Who ate what, when, and how much, revealed your place in the world. And flavor was still scarce. Most meals were under-seasoned. There were herbs, like sage, thyme, or parsley, but these were local and mild. Spices from abroad were expensive and tightly controlled. In fact, in some regions, laws restricted who could buy certain spices. Cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon were for the wealthy. A pinch of pepper could cost as much as a laborer earned in a week. That meant the rich sometimes added spices just to show off, even when it didn't taste good. Meanwhile, the poor used what they had. Sour sorrel, wild garlic, mustard seeds. These added some flavor, but nothing like modern meals. There were no sauces, no sugar-glazed dishes, no creamy textures. No chocolate. No tea. No coffee. Most food was mushy, bitter, or dry. And for those who lived near the sea, salt fish became a curse of its own. Dried cod was so hard it had to be beaten with a hammer before soaking. The smell was overwhelming. The taste, never fully pleasant. But it lasted. And lasting mattered more than flavor. Every bite was a compromise. Every meal, a calculation. Would this feed the family? Would it last the week? Would it make us sick? And as we move deeper into this world of wooden bowls and boiling pots, we'll discover how even the way food was shared, or denied, shaped the entire structure of medieval life. In the medieval world, food was never just food. It was a reflection of status, power, and survival. Who got to eat, and who went without, was one of the clearest ways society defined itself. Across villages, towns, castles, and monasteries, every table told a story. And most of those stories were quiet, repetitive, and deeply unequal. At the top of the food chain, quite literally, were the nobles. Lords, barons, and kings had access to ingredients most people would never see. They feasted in great halls on long tables covered with cloth, served by attendants, entertained by music. There were roasts, pies, and elaborate displays. But even these meals weren't what we'd call delicious today. Meat might be undercooked. Spices used in overwhelming amounts. Sauces were thickened with breadcrumbs or ground almonds. Presentation mattered more than taste. Still, for the poor, it must have seemed like magic, or cruelty. While peasants gnawed stale bread and boiled cabbage, their lords dined on swan, peacock, and boar. But these animals weren't chosen for flavor. They were chosen for appearance, symbolism, and bragging rights. Sometimes, cooks would serve a bird with its feathers reattached after roasting, making it look alive on the plate. It was spectacle over substance. Yet even within the noble class, not everyone ate equally. Servants and guards received less and ate separately. Leftovers from the Lord's table, known as broken meats, might be handed down to lower-ranking members of the household. These scraps were considered gifts. But they were still scraps. Meanwhile, peasants' diets barely changed from year to year. There were small moments of relief, harvest festivals, weddings, or saints' days, when people might enjoy extra bread or some ale. But these were brief, and the food still came from the same limited pool of ingredients. There were no sudden oranges from afar, no surprise pastries, no indulgent desserts. And in times of war or plague, things grew even worse. Armies often marched through farmland, trampling crops, stealing livestock, or demanding grain for their own use. Fields were abandoned. Markets closed. When the Black Death struck, entire villages were wiped out, and food systems collapsed. With fewer farmers, fewer bakers, and fewer hands to work the mills, hunger returned in waves. Famine was not rare. It came in cycles. Heavy rain ruined crops. Drought shriveled fields. Insects devoured grain stores. And when food became scarce, prices soared. Bread that cost a penny might suddenly cost 4. Those with silver survived. Those without starved. In many cases, people turned to desperate measures. There are recorded accounts of bark being boiled, leather chewed, even animal dung sifted for undigested grain. Charity existed, but it had limits. Churches sometimes offered food to the poor, especially on religious holidays. Rich donors established almshouses that fed a few people daily. But these acts were more symbolic than systematic. Hunger remained a daily presence for millions. And hunger changed people. It shortened tempers. It stunted growth. Children who grew up without enough food often remained small, sickly, and vulnerable to disease. It wasn't just discomfort, it was a life sentence. Generations passed down not recipes, but coping strategies: how to stretch a pot of stew, how to boil bread crusts into soup, how to find edible weeds. Yet in all this hardship, food still carried meaning. Sharing a loaf of bread could symbolize peace. Offering ale to a neighbor built trust. Even something as small as a boiled egg might mark a celebration. But if there was one thing that united rich and poor alike, from castles to cottages, it was this: the knowledge that food, no matter how simple or strange, was never guaranteed. Every bite was earned. Every meal a small victory. And in the next part of our journey, we'll look at how the church shaped what people could, and couldn't, eat, sometimes down to the very day. In medieval Europe, the church wasn't just a place of worship, it was a powerful force that reached into every part of life, including the food on your plate. Religious rules didn't just shape prayers or holidays. They determined what people could eat, when they could eat it, and even how much. For many, the church's calendar became the menu. At the center of these restrictions were fasting days. These were not just for Lent, the 40 days before Easter, but included dozens of other dates throughout the year. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays were often designated as days of abstinence. On these days, people were forbidden from eating meat, dairy, and sometimes even eggs. In total, the average medieval person spent more than a third of the year avoiding these foods. This created a challenge: how to fill a stomach when the best ingredients were off limits. The answer was fish. Fish was allowed. Not because it was healthier or tastier, but because it wasn't considered meat in the spiritual sense. That distinction mattered a great deal. It meant fish became the default protein for fasting days, and demand for it soared. But fresh fish was hard to come by. People living near rivers or coasts might catch eels, herring, or trout. But inland, the options were limited. Transporting fresh fish was slow and expensive. Most peasants couldn't afford it. Instead, preserved fish became the standard: salted cod, smoked herring, and dried stockfish, a type of cod that had been hardened until it was almost inedible. Before cooking, stockfish had to be beaten with a hammer, then soaked for hours. It still smelled awful. But it was food. For monasteries and wealthier homes, fish farming became a solution. Monks dug fish ponds on monastery grounds, raising carp or tench. These ponds required maintenance, but they offered a steady source of food that didn't violate religious rules. Even some lords constructed fish ponds on their estates to ensure a supply during fasting periods. But these fish were small, muddy, and bland, better than nothing, but far from delicious. There were also clever ways to bend the rules. Some cooks disguised meat as fish, molding it into new shapes or covering it in fish sauce. Others claimed that beavers, since they had tails like fish, could be eaten on fasting days, a ruling that some clergy actually supported. In parts of Europe, even barnacle geese were declared fish because people believed they hatched from barnacles on ships. These odd interpretations show just how far people would go to keep food on the table without offending religious authorities. The church also introduced rules about gluttony. Eating too much, or enjoying food too greatly, was seen as a sin. Meals were meant to be simple and modest. Lavish banquets could be condemned unless they were for religious feasts or honored guests. In monasteries, meals were eaten in silence, often with a monk reading scripture aloud. It wasn't just about nourishment, it was about discipline. Even feast days, which allowed richer food, were governed by ritual. Christmas, Easter, and Saints' days brought special dishes, pies, spiced wine, or roasted meats, but only if you had the means to afford them. For most peasants, these days were marked not by delicacies but by slightly larger portions of the same old stew, maybe with a bit of bread or cheese on the side. And so, throughout the year, people adjusted their diets again and again, guided by a calendar not of seasons, but of saints. Hunger didn't rest, but it adapted. Next, we'll explore what children ate, and how growing up in such a food system shaped not only bodies, but entire generations. In the medieval world, childhood was brief and uncertain. Many children didn't survive past infancy, and those who did grew up quickly, often helping in the fields or the kitchen by the time they could walk. But what did they eat? The answer depends on where they lived, how rich their families were, and whether they were lucky enough to avoid disease and famine. Still, most children shared one thing in common: their food was limited, simple, and repetitive. For the poorest families, meals were often shared from one pot, literally. A large clay or iron pot might hang over the fire, filled with pottage, a kind of vegetable and grain stew. This was the same meal eaten day after day, sometimes thickened with beans or peas, sometimes flavored with wild herbs or onion. Meat was rare. If a rabbit or chicken found its way into the pot, it was a special occasion. Children usually received the smallest portions. They ate last, after parents and elders had taken their share. Milk was sometimes available, but not always. Cows didn't produce as much as modern breeds do, and milk spoiled fast without refrigeration. Instead, milk was often turned into cheese or butter, which lasted longer. But these were valuable and not always reserved for children. Babies were breastfed if possible, but if the mother couldn't nurse, wet nurses were used, if the family could afford one. Otherwise, infants were fed gruel made from mashed grain and water, which often lacked enough nutrients. There were no baby foods, no vitamins, no understanding of balanced nutrition. Children ate what adults ate, just in smaller amounts and with fewer options. That meant no sweets, no treats, and certainly no snacks. If a child grew hungry between meals, they were told to wait. If they begged, they might be given a crust of bread or a few boiled beans. Hunger was a familiar feeling, especially in winter. In noble households, children had more access to food, but that didn't mean they were well fed by today's standards. They still followed the church's fasting rules. They still ate seasonal foods. But they were more likely to eat meat, eggs, and soft bread made from fine white flour. Servants prepared separate meals for noble children, sometimes overseen by governesses or tutors. These meals might include stewed fruits, sweetened with honey if it was available, or almond milk, a medieval favorite made by grinding almonds and mixing them with water. But even in castles, children weren't spoiled. Food was considered part of discipline, not comfort. Illness from poor diet was common. Children often suffered from hunger fevers, weakness, or skin conditions caused by lack of vitamins. Tooth decay began early, especially among wealthier children who consumed honey or dried fruits. But dentistry didn't exist, and rotten teeth were simply accepted. In some towns, especially during hard times, children were sent out to beg. In others, they worked in kitchens, fetching water or turning spits. They learned how to stretch ingredients, how to cook over fire, how to save scraps. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was survival knowledge. If you didn't learn how to cook, preserve, and eat wisely, you didn't last long. Festivals were often the only time children might taste something sweet. During holidays like Easter or All Saints' Day, small pastries were baked, sometimes shaped into animals or symbols. If a family had extra honey or nuts, they might roast them over the fire. But these moments were rare, more memory than habit. And in the countryside, many children learned early which wild plants could be eaten and which to avoid. Nettles could be cooked. Sorrel added sourness to soup. Mushrooms were risky, and mistakes could be fatal. In this world, childhood didn't come with cookies, cakes, or comfort food. It came with boiled roots, stale bread, and endless repetition. And next, we'll look deeper into that repetition, how the seasons shaped not only the crops, but the mood of entire villages. The medieval year was not divided by months and holidays the way we often think of time today. It was divided by the seasons, and for most people, those seasons were defined by food. What grew, what could be harvested, what could be stored, all of this shifted with the weather. And with each shift came changes not just in meals, but in mood, energy, and even survival. Spring was a time of hunger. While it marked the end of winter's cold, it also meant food stores were nearly empty. The salted meat and dried beans kept over the winter were running out. Fresh crops hadn't yet grown. This period was sometimes called the hungry gap. People grew thin, tired, and sick more easily. Children might be sent to gather wild greens, dandelion, sorrel, nettles, anything to add flavor and nutrients to the same tired pot of pottage. Eggs returned as hens began to lay again, but they were few at first. When summer arrived, fields came to life. Barley, rye, and wheat ripened. Turnips, carrots, and onions could be pulled from the ground. This was the time when hard work dominated daily life. From dawn to dusk, families worked to harvest, dry, and store what they could. Meals became slightly more generous, stews thickened, bread more frequent. But there was little time to enjoy it. The focus was on preparation, not pleasure. A good summer could mean enough to survive the winter. A bad one meant hardship ahead. Autumn was harvest time, the most important season of all. Grains were gathered and ground. Fruits were picked and dried. Nuts were collected. Cabbages were buried underground to preserve them. Meat, if available, was slaughtered before winter, since feeding animals through the cold months was difficult. Pork was salted, sausages hung in rafters, lard rendered into jars. For a few weeks, food was plentiful. There were village festivals, feasts after the harvest, songs and dances. This was the one moment each year when even the poor might feel full. But it never lasted long. Then came winter. With snow and cold winds came silence in the fields. Nothing grew. Meals shrank. Root vegetables, if they hadn't frozen, were boiled into thin soups. Bread became hard and dry. Meat, if any, was stringy and oversalted. Milk was rare. Fresh greens were gone. Days were short, and fires were expensive to keep burning. People slept more, moved less, and watched their stores carefully. Spoilage was feared. Mold could destroy sacks of grain. Mice could chew through bags of flour. A single error in autumn could mean hunger by February. Food was stored in clever ways. Beans were hung from the ceiling. Cheese was waxed and hidden in cool corners. Apples were wrapped and buried. But even these methods were imperfect. Cold and damp crept in everywhere. And for many families, hunger in winter wasn't just expected, it was accepted. The changing seasons taught people patience, discipline, and fear. They prayed for mild winters and dry harvests. They tracked the phases of the moon, the shape of clouds, the behavior of animals, looking for signs of what the next season would bring. And all the while, the food remained much the same. Simple, bland, familiar. In towns, things were a bit different. Markets offered more variety, especially for those with coin. But even there, the seasons ruled. A merchant couldn't sell what didn't grow. And without modern transportation, exotic foods remained rare and expensive. Bananas, tomatoes, or potatoes were entirely unknown in medieval Europe. Oranges were a luxury. Sugar was medicine. And tea simply didn't exist. Next, we'll explore what happened when food wasn't just scarce, but rotten, spoiled, or dangerous, and how people tried to protect themselves in a world that knew nothing about germs. In a world without refrigeration, expiration dates, or modern food safety standards, medieval people lived in constant risk of eating something that could make them sick, or worse. Spoiled food was everywhere. But hunger was stronger than fear, and so people ate what they could, even if it smelled odd, tasted sour, or looked strange. Illness was common, but most didn't know the true cause. They blamed the stars, bad air, or even divine punishment, never bacteria. Meat was one of the most dangerous items. In summer, it spoiled within hours. Even in winter, without ice, it couldn't be stored for long. To preserve it, people turned to salt, lots of it. Meat was rubbed with salt, buried in barrels of brine, or smoked for days. This helped it last, but it changed the flavor and texture. Salted beef became leathery. Smoked fish turned hard. Some meats had to be boiled for hours to become edible again. Even then, the result was often tough and flavorless. People had little choice. They cut off mold. They scraped away green edges. They smelled, poked, and guessed. A pot of stew might sit over the fire for days, added to again and again. If it went sour, it was just called sour stew. If milk curdled, it was turned into cheese. If bread grew mold, the mold might be cut off, or the bread dunked into hot broth to soften it. Bread itself was risky. Flour could go rancid. Rats and insects infested grain stores. Sometimes, grains were milled into flour without being fully cleaned, and that flour ended up mixed with bits of dirt, straw, or even droppings. The poorest people often ate bread made with maslin, a mix of wheat and rye, sometimes barley. In some years, the rye contained a fungus called ergot. Ergot poisoning caused hallucinations, seizures, and even death. People called it St. Anthony's fire, and it could sweep through entire communities, mistaken for a curse. Water, too, was unsafe. Wells were often close to latrines. Streams were polluted with waste. Drinking straight from the river was risky, and yet, many did. Boiling water was not common practice. Instead, people drank ale, even children. Ale was weak, often barely alcoholic, but it was boiled during brewing, which made it safer than water. Some monasteries brewed beer specifically to give away as charity, not for pleasure, but for health. Cheese, eggs, and butter spoiled quickly. Without cool cellars, they turned sour. Eggs might rot inside their shells. Butter turned rancid. People used herbs to mask smells, or vinegar to clean. But often, they simply got used to the taste. And then there were the outright scams. In town markets, sellers sometimes used tricks to disguise bad food. Rotten fish was rubbed with ashes to darken it, making it look fresh. Bad meat might be soaked in wine or vinegar. Stale pies were reheated and resold. There were laws against these practices, but enforcement was weak. A cook might face punishment if caught, but often, no one could prove where the illness came from. When people did get sick, they turned to remedies that were more hopeful than effective. Herbal teas, poultices, bloodletting. Garlic was believed to purify the blood. Mustard seeds were thought to heat the stomach. Prayers were always part of the cure. But most just waited and hoped. Despite all this, eating was still necessary. People developed strong stomachs, or died young. Meals weren't joyful events. They were routines, obligations, acts of endurance. Flavor was a bonus. Survival came first. In the final part, we'll reflect on how food in the Middle Ages wasn't just about hunger, but about power, habit, and the quiet strength it took to get through each day. By the end of a long medieval day, food was never far from the mind. Whether you were a peasant scraping the bottom of a stew pot, a monk chewing cold fish in silence, or a noble eating spiced meat with a dull appetite, the act of eating was rarely about pleasure. It was about routine, rules, and survival. But behind every mouthful was something deeper, a reflection of who held power, who followed, and who endured. For the powerful, food became a tool of control. Lords distributed grain to their peasants, but only if loyalty was shown. Kings hosted feasts not just to celebrate, but to display wealth. A long table full of meat, wine, and bread was not just a meal, it was a message. I have more than enough. I can feed armies. I can afford waste. In a hungry world, abundance was power. In the church, food took on spiritual weight. Fasting was seen as a sign of piety. Eating too much was gluttony, one of the 7 deadly sins. Monks measured their portions. Nuns avoided indulgence. Entire orders practiced food deprivation to feel closer to God. But even this had hierarchy. Higher-ranking clergy might quietly enjoy better meals than the common monk, richer soups, better cuts of meat, imported spices. Discipline, like food, was not equally distributed. For women, food was another area of control. In many households, women prepared every meal, but rarely chose the ingredients. They spent hours over fire, soaking grains, turning butter, cutting roots, all to serve the needs of husbands, children, or masters. A burnt crust or watery porridge could invite scolding. Food could earn praise, but never rest. And yet, for all its hardship, food also held moments of quiet resilience. A shared loaf between neighbors. A handful of wild berries picked by a child. A grandmother passing down how to dry herbs, or how to bake flatbread with nothing but ash and flour. These were acts of memory, connection, and hope, even when the meals themselves were bland and meager. Over time, some things changed. Trade grew. Spices arrived. Potatoes and tomatoes, unknown in medieval Europe, would later revolutionize cooking. But that was in the distant future. In the Middle Ages, meals remained rooted in the soil, in superstition, in scarcity, and in habit. People woke up hungry, worked hungry, and slept hungry. They accepted what was given, and stretched what little they had. They learned to recognize which mushrooms could kill, which fish to salt, which grains to mix. They didn't ask if a dish was tasty. They asked if it would last until tomorrow. Even in castles, with feasts and gold-plated cups, the food was often cold by the time it reached the table. Spices masked the taste of rot. Candles flickered over greasy meat and overboiled vegetables. The luxury was in having too much, not in having anything good. So, why was food so bad in the Middle Ages? Because it had to be. Without science, without safety, without surplus, people learned to survive with what they had, not because it was satisfying, but because it kept them going. They didn't expect delight. They expected enough. And sometimes, just enough was a victory.